black bear shot on Maiden Lane in the 1630s. There were wolves on Manhattan until the 1720s. There was a mountain lion that was treed not very far from here in the 1670s, if you can imagine. The people that lived here, it's very important that when we talk about Manhattan, we don't imagine it as a landscape without any people. There were certainly people here. These Native Americans, Lenape, or as they're sometimes known as the Delaware people, and they still live today, although mainly in Oklahoma and Wisconsin and up in Canada. They had a sort of mobile lifestyle where they would move 3 or 4 times during the year. They'd go down to the rivers during the spring to fish, and they would go and plant their crops in the better places of the middle of the island during the summer, and then spend their winters in the Bronx, Queens, more protected locales, or up in Inwood. They created wampum. They had really abundant natural resources all around them, so shellfish and the fish, as well as the wildlife. They hunted deer and perhaps elk. They collected all kinds of nuts and berries and roots and tubers that were used for a whole variety of different purposes. And they built their own homes, their own wigwams, out of materials that were found locally here on Manhattan Island. So we can sort of connect these species together by talking about their habitat requirements, by documenting their food, water, shelter, and reproductive requirements. So like I said, this is, in some essence, the definition of home. Home is where you get what you need. So we would take habitat descriptions like this from the literature and really start to map out how they're connected to each other. So beavers need streams and aspens and alders and willows. Bog turtles need wet meadows and insects and sunny places. Bobcats need rabbits and beavers and den sites. And in the context of this, we would discover connections, how beavers can be here and it can also be here. And then you can ask questions. So what does an aspen need? When you put down your beaver book and you pick up your aspen book, and aspens need fire and dry soils. Or what do wet meadows need? They need beavers to create those dams, or they need other sorts of factors. Or what do sunny places need? Or what do dry soils need? That there's these conditionalities and dependencies that are in fact at the very core of what ecology is all about the interactions between different organisms that are living in the same environment. And you can create a map of these, a virtual map that in the case of Manhattan has 1,600 elements across the top and 1,600 elements right into the stage floor, running down below. And that you can visualize that network as what we call a mirror web, which describes all the habitat relationships for all the plants and animals that once lived on Manhattan. And so this is a picture of the tight interdependence and dense kinds of interactions that happened on Manhattan, where every point here is a different plant or an animal, and every line is a habitat relationship, a food relationship, a water relationship, a shelter relationship, or a relationship related to reproduction. And you can actually see the kind of dense interactions that made the island work, made the landscape work, actually is what characterizes the sort of resilience and strength of nature. We call these after John Muir, who said that when we try and pick out anything by itself, we find it bound fast by 1,000 invisible cords that cannot be broken to everything in the universe. And then we use these to make maps, to actually generate a map for just up the street, 85th to 86th and 3rd and Likes. And maybe in that block there were these kinds of trees, these kinds of shrubs and flowers, and maybe these kinds of mosses and lichens, or insects, or fish in the stream, or birds in the trees, or maybe a timber rattlesnake lived nearby, or a black bear would walk by, or maybe there was a Native American trail, and actually generate a list of the biodiversity as it might have been in 1609, as it might have been 400 years ago. And use this to talk about the ecological potential of the place, right? That every place has ecological potential. The city does not erase that potential. It modifies that potential. Modifies it severely in some cases, and yet that potential still exists. And because we're creating the city, we are also creating the opportunity to open that potential or to close that potential down. And the biodiversity exists not only in places overseas, but actually here on Manhattan. And we built a website where you can actually go and see this for your block and actually zoom in to any particular block. You can zoom into this block and bring up a picture of what that looked like 400 years ago and get a list of all the plants and animals that once lived in that block. So finally, in this third act, we reveal the landscape. So working with my colleague, Mark Boyer, we took the kind of tools that Hollywood uses to create these fantastic landscapes like you might see here And we used it to try and generate what Third Avenue might have looked like 400 years ago. So we would build the model of the topography like I showed you before, and then fill that in with soil and water and with light. And then lay on top of that the map of the different ecological communities, and then fill them in with the distributions of all the plants and animals that lived in those communities. And remember, this is all based on the British headquarters map, so it's all geo-referenced. So in this particular instance, we're floating above Times Square and looking out toward the west, toward New Jersey. It's a specific place. We can actually reconstruct the view out of any window anywhere in Manhattan and show you what that view once looked like 400 years ago. So this is the view from the East River, floating in a dugout canoe, looking up toward Murray Hill at the streams that came down into the tidal wetlands there. Or this view flying up above the Hudson River and looking down on that beach at 125th Street and the long narrow island of Manhattan on the left and the New Jersey Palisades as a way of talking about the importance of the tidal estuary and the Hudson River to this place, to this Manhattan place. Or to imagine Henry Hudson's ship moored off of 42nd Street. And through the trees, you can just get a glimpse of the beaver pond, and you can see the flock of passenger pigeons flying up in the air. Or to go down to the Clack Pond, where we can see the Native American fields and the smoke rising through the wigwams. We can see the different forest types and the salt marshes and the tidal channels braiding through them and the Hudson River back beyond. And we can see this in the context of the city today. So I think the point of all this is to try and capture the imagination, right? To actually insert an idea into what it means to be a New Yorker that's a green idea. So where we recognize that we come from a place, Manhattan, that was remarkable for its biodiversity, remarkable for the diverse habitats that we're here. It was remarkable for the density of interactions that made it work, and that had a sustainability. If Henry Hudson hadn't sailed into the harbor on September 12, 1609, and started in motion that series of historical events, Manhattan would have continued to provide habitat and not a static landscape, but a landscape of change that was also continually renewing itself in a way that allowed all the plants and animals to live there, more than 1,000 of them. But I think this is the very point, that these themes that are so true about ecology are also true about the city as a complex system. The city is remarkable for its diversity, because of the diversity of all of us and all the people that are outside the building today that are here finding a way to make their living here. There's people from every nation on earth living in New York City and finding a place where it's habitat for them, where it's home for them. We find that part of what's so great about New York City and large cities in general is the sort of density of interactions that make them work. Both the direct interactions that we have through conferences like this, and the ability to meet each other and to form new relationships, whether that's about business or sociality or art or culture or science, but also the indirect interactions that allow us to be here, the people that are taking care of the sewer system and the water system and the power system and the transportation system. And we really need to appreciate the work that they're doing that allows us to live here. The big question that's facing us, and which is in fact facing the whole world, is how do we make this place sustainable over the long run? How are we going to make it last for 100 years or for 400 years, where it maintains these same qualities of diversity and density and openness and strong interaction, but in a way that doesn't take so many resources from out in the world, right? Because of course we know that this landscape that we're seeing today, that created mostly through the 20th century, is a landscape that's entirely wedded to fossil fuels, entirely wedded to energy that was actually shed on the earth millions and millions and millions of years ago. So if Christine will give me 2 more minutes, to do a brief epilogue. Sorry, 2409. I think it's really important to think over the long term, and I'll second what was said before, that cities are habitat for people, and we need to think of them that way. That they are our home, and we have to see them as defined as their food, their water, their shelter, and their reproductive resources. Of course, what's so interesting about the history of cities to me is how much cities are focused on what is arguably the unique requirement for human beings, which is the sense of meaning. This thing that comes with having these large brains that requires us to seek out art and science and each other. And cities are so great, particularly New York City, is so great about satisfying the sense of meaning and satisfaction to be human beings.